Dr. Sarah Chen adjusted her diving gear one final time before stepping into the crystal blue waters of Lake Zephyria. The alien world of Kepler 442c had been humanity's first successful colony outside the solar system, and this massive freshwater lake remained one of its greatest mysteries. The water was breathable for humans thanks to unique oxygen-producing algae, making it perfect for extended underwater exploration. Sarah had been studying the lake's ecosystem for 3 months, documenting species that defied Earth biology. Today felt different, though. Her sonar readings had detected something massive moving in the deepest trenches, something that shouldn't exist according to every scan they'd run from orbit. As she descended past the 100-meter mark, the familiar schools of translucent fish parted around her. The water grew colder and bioluminescent creatures began to appear like living stars in the darkness. Her headlamp cut through the murky depths, revealing ancient rock formations that seemed almost deliberately carved. At 200 meters, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Massive stone pillars rose from the lake floor, connected by chains that gleamed with an otherworldly metal. The structure was clearly artificial, built by intelligence far beyond anything they'd encountered on this world. But it was what lay between those pillars that made her heart race with both terror and wonder. A creature of impossible beauty hung suspended in the water, bound by those same gleaming chains. It was easily 30 meters long, with scales that shifted between deep emerald and electric blue. Wing-like fins stretched from its serpentine body, while a regal head bore features that seemed both reptilian and impossibly expressive. Even in the dim light, Sarah could see the intelligence burning in those large amber eyes. The creature noticed her approach and lifted its head with effort. The chains prevented much movement, but Sarah could see the desperation in its gaze. This was no mindless beast. This was a being of clear intelligence trapped in suffering. The dragon's mouth opened slightly, releasing a stream of bubbles that formed complex patterns in the water. Language. It was trying to communicate. Sarah swam closer, her scientific training warring with every survival instinct. The creature could easily crush her, chains or no chains, but something in those ancient eyes spoke of wisdom rather than violence. As she approached, the dragon's struggles ceased. It watched her with careful attention, as if trying to determine whether this strange, small visitor meant help or harm. The chains were unlike anything in human technology. They pulsed with a faint energy signature that her instruments couldn't identify. Each link was as thick as Sarah's torso, and they wrapped around the creature's body at precise points, the base of the neck, around the torso, and at the tail. Whoever had imprisoned this being knew exactly how to restrain something of its size and apparent power. Sarah circled the creature slowly, documenting everything with her underwater camera. The dragon tracked her movement but made no aggressive gestures. If anything, it seemed curious about her presence. When she passed close to its head, the creature made a low thrumming sound that vibrated through the water and into Sarah's bones. The sound was hauntingly beautiful, like a whale song mixed with the resonance of a church organ. As she completed her circuit, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. The creature's scales showed signs of long imprisonment. Some were dull and scarred, while others had grown over the chains in places, suggesting decades or perhaps centuries of captivity. This magnificent being had been here for an impossibly long time, trapped and alone in the depths. The dragon's eyes followed her as she swam back to face it directly. There was something almost pleading in that gaze, a desperate hope that perhaps this encounter might be different from whatever had come before. Sarah reached out tentatively, her gloved hand stopping just short of the creature's snout. The dragon remained perfectly still, watching her with an intensity that suggested it understood the significance of this moment. Sarah's air supply gauge reminded her that she needed to surface soon, but leaving felt like abandonment. She pressed her hand gently against the dragon's snout, feeling the warmth that radiated even through her thick gloves. The creature's eyes widened and it made another of those haunting sounds, softer this time, almost grateful. As Sarah began her ascent, she looked back to see the dragon watching her departure. Even from a distance, those amber eyes seemed to burn with new hope. For the first time in who knew how long, the creature had encountered a being that showed no fear, no hatred, only curiosity and perhaps compassion. Breaking the surface of Lake Zephyria, Sarah treaded water as she processed what she'd witnessed. Every protocol said she should report this immediately to the colonial authorities. But something held her back. The pleading look in those ancient eyes. The careful way the creature had controlled its immense strength in her presence. This was no monster to be studied and exploited. As she swam back to shore, Sarah's mind raced with questions. Who had chained this magnificent creature? Why? And most importantly, was there any way to set it free? The chains seemed beyond human technology to break, but perhaps there was another way. Perhaps understanding was the first step toward liberation. That night, Sarah lay awake staring at the ceiling of her research station, unable to shake the image of those desperate, intelligent eyes. Tomorrow she would return to the depths not as a scientist documenting a discovery, but as someone who had recognized a kindred spirit crying out for freedom from the darkness below. Sarah returned to the lake at dawn, her diving pack loaded with every piece of communication equipment she could carry. The translation software designed for first contact scenarios might work, if the dragon's vocalizations followed any recognizable patterns. She'd spent the night analyzing the recordings from yesterday, finding mathematical sequences hidden in the creature's calls that suggested sophisticated intelligence. The descent felt different this time. Sarah moved with purpose, guided by beacon markers she'd placed the day before. As she approached the prison of stone and metal, the dragon was already watching for her return. Its massive head lifted as much as the chains allowed, and those amber eyes seemed to brighten at her approach. Sarah activated her translation array and swam to a position where she could observe the creature's full form. She began with simple mathematical concepts, using her lights to flash prime numbers in sequence. The dragon watched intently, then responded with its own pattern of bioluminescent pulses from nodes along its neck that Sarah hadn't noticed before. The creature was sending back the Fibonacci sequence. Excitement flooded through Sarah as she realized she was witnessing first contact with an intelligent alien species. But this wasn't the sterile, controlled environment Earth's protocols had envisioned. This was a conversation with a prisoner, a being that had been suffering in isolation for an unknown span of time. The dragon's vocalizations grew more complex as it realized Sarah was actively trying to communicate. The translation software began identifying recurring patterns, slowly building a basic vocabulary. Concepts of time, pain, loneliness, and hope began to emerge from the beautiful, haunting sounds the creature made. Through painstaking exchanges using mathematics, simple pictographs Sarah drew on her waterproof tablet, and gestural communication, a story began to emerge. The dragon's name was something that translated roughly to Storm Singer of the Deep Waters. She belonged to a species called the Ithrani, beings who had once soared through the skies and depths of this world with equal grace. Storm Singer had been one of the youngest of her kind when the Devourers came. The translation software struggled with that concept until Storm Singer managed to convey images of crystalline beings that consumed life force itself, leaving dead worlds in their wake. The Ithrani had fought desperately to protect their world, but they were a peaceful species, artists and philosophers rather than warriors. The Devourers had ultimately been defeated, but at a terrible cost. In the final battle, Stormsinger and several others had been captured and bound with chains forged from the Devourers' own technology. The chains were designed to slowly drain their life force, weakening them until they could be consumed at leisure. But something had gone wrong. The Devourers had been destroyed or driven off before they could return for their prisoners. Stormsinger had been trapped for over 3,000 Earth years, watching her fellow Ithrani die one by one as the chains slowly sapped their strength. She was the last, kept alive by sheer will and the hope that someday someone would find her and understand that she was more than just a monster to be feared. Sarah's heart ached as she processed this information. 3 millennia of solitary confinement, watching friends die, slowly weakening as alien technology drained away life itself. The fact that Stormsinger had maintained her sanity and capacity for hope spoke to a strength of spirit that humbled the human researcher. The dragon showed Sarah how the chains worked, demonstrating how they pulsed with energy drawn from her body. The metal was alive in a sense, a parasitic technology that fed on the life force of its victims. Worse, the chains were designed to tighten if tampered with, making escape attempts potentially fatal. But Stormsinger had observed the prison's construction during her long captivity. The chains were anchored to a central control nexus buried beneath the lake floor. If that nexus could be disrupted, all the chains would release simultaneously. The problem was that the Nexus was heavily shielded and located in a chasm far too narrow for an Ethrani to reach, even if freed from the chains. Sarah understood immediately. Stormsinger had spent centuries studying her prison, waiting for someone small enough and clever enough to reach the Nexus. Someone exactly like a human diver. The dragon's excitement was palpable as she realized Sarah grasped the implications. Through rapid exchanges, Stormsinger began sharing everything she'd learned about the prison's construction. The Nexus was 200 meters deeper, accessible through a crack in the lake floor barely wide enough for a human to pass through. But the journey would be dangerous. The Nexus was guarded by automated defenses left behind by the Devourers. Sarah studied the rough maps Stormsinger created by arranging stones with her massive claws. The path to the Nexus was treacherous, filled with energy traps and mechanical guardians that had remained active for millennia. Even if Sarah could reach the Nexus, she would need to understand Devourer technology well enough to safely shut it down without triggering failsafes that might kill Stormsinger instantly. As Sarah's air supply again forced her to ascend, she promised Stormsinger she would return. The dragon's gratitude was overwhelming, transmitted through subsonic vibrations that seemed to resonate in Sarah's very bones. For the first time in 3,000 years, Stormsinger had hope for freedom. And that hope was placed in the hands of a being she'd known for less than 2 days. Surfacing in the alien sunlight, Sarah realized she faced an impossible choice. Colonial protocols demanded she report the discovery immediately, but doing so would likely result in Stormsinger becoming a specimen for study rather than a being to be rescued. The dragon would trade one form of imprisonment for another, and Sarah couldn't bear the thought of betraying that trust. That evening, Sarah made her decision. She would attempt the rescue herself, using her expertise in underwater operations and her growing understanding of Devourer technology. If she failed, at least Stormsinger would know that someone had tried. If she succeeded, humanity would gain not just an ally, but proof that compassion and courage could triumph over any imprisonment, no matter how ancient or seemingly permanent. Sarah spent the next 3 days preparing for what might be a suicide mission. She couldn't requisition the equipment she needed through official channels without triggering questions she couldn't answer, so she had to be creative. Her research station contained enough spare parts and experimental gear to cobble together what she hoped would be sufficient protection against ancient alien defenses. Working in secret, Sarah modified her diving suit with additional power cells and reinforced plating salvaged from mining equipment. She programmed her portable scanner to recognize the energy signatures Stormsinger had described, hoping to detect traps before triggering them. Most importantly, she studied every piece of data they'd gathered on the Devourers from other colony worlds, searching for patterns in their technology that might help her understand the Nexus controls. The Devourers were builders of crystalline machinery that functioned on principles human science barely understood. Their technology seemed to operate on a hybrid of advanced physics and something that resembled magic to human observers. But they had patterns, mathematical constants that appeared in all their constructions. If Sarah could recognize those patterns in the Nexus, she might be able to find the shutdown sequence. Stormsinger had provided detailed descriptions of the Nexus chamber, conveyed through their growing shared vocabulary. The control system was a towering crystal formation, surrounded by smaller satellite crystals that pulsed in complex patterns. Somewhere in that arrangement was the key to releasing the chains, but touching the wrong crystal could trigger defenses that would kill both Sarah and Stormsinger instantly. On the morning of the 4th day, Sarah made her descent carrying enough equipment to feel like a walking equipment locker. Her modified suit was heavier but offered better protection, while her pack contained tools, scanners, and emergency supplies for what could be a very long journey into the depths. Stormsinger was waiting for her, having somehow sensed her approach even from hundreds of meters away. The dragon's excitement was tempered by concern as she saw Sarah's heavily laden form. Through their established communication methods, Stormsinger expressed worry about the dangers ahead. The defenses had killed everything that had approached the Nexus for 3 millennia. Automated guardians that showed no mercy and felt no fatigue. Sarah reassured her friend as best she could, showing Stormsinger the modifications she'd made to her equipment. The dragon studied each piece with keen intelligence, offering suggestions through gesture and vocalization that improved Sarah's understanding of what she would face. Stormsinger's knowledge of Devourer technology, gained through long observation and interaction with her chains, proved invaluable. Together, they refined the plan. Sarah would follow a specific route that Stormsinger had identified as having the fewest active defenses. The dragon would create disturbances in the water to mask Sarah's approach where possible, using her limited mobility to generate currents and pressure waves that might confuse the ancient sensors. The entrance to the chasm was a jagged crack in the lake floor that looked like a wound in the earth itself. Strange formations of the same crystalline material as the chains jutted from the edges, pulsing with a malevolent light that made Sarah's instruments register dangerous energy levels. This was clearly devourer work, designed to discourage exactly the kind of infiltration Sarah was attempting. Stormsinger guided Sarah to the safest approach angle, explaining through their shared mathematical language exactly where the sensor fields overlapped and where gaps in coverage might exist. The dragon's 3,000 years of observation had turned her into an expert on her own prison security systems, knowledge she now shared with the human who might finally free her. As Sarah prepared to enter the chasm, Stormsinger performed something that could only be described as a blessing. The dragon's bioluminescent nodes flared in complex patterns, while she sang a hauntingly beautiful song that resonated through the water and into Sarah's bones. The meaning was clear without translation. This was a prayer for success, a sending off for a warrior heading into battle. The crack in the lake floor was barely wide enough for Sarah to pass through, and the walls pressed close on either side as she descended. Strange growths of crystalline material created a maze of passages, each pulsing with different rhythms of light. Sarah's scanner helped her identify which passages were safe and which led to obvious traps. But the deeper she went, the more complex the defenses became. After an hour of careful navigation, Sarah encountered her first active guardian. The creature was unlike anything in human experience, a geometric shape that seemed to exist in too many dimensions at once, covered in crystalline protrusions that sparked with deadly energy. It moved with purpose and intelligence, clearly designed to eliminate intruders. Sarah's modified suit absorbed the first energy blast, but she could tell the shielding wouldn't hold up to sustained attack. Using quick thinking and her knowledge of three-dimensional movement, she maneuvered around the Guardian's blind spots while it tried to track her position. The creature was powerful but seemed designed to fight larger, less agile opponents. Managing to slip past the first Guardian, Sarah found herself in a tunnel that stretched deeper into the planet's crust. The walls here were covered in devourer script that pulsed with meaning just beyond her understanding. Her translation software worked frantically to decode the symbols, gradually building a picture of warnings and instructions that spoke of the horrors that awaited intruders. But Sarah pressed on, driven by the memory of Stormsinger's desperate hope and the knowledge that she might be the dragon's only chance at freedom. Each meter deeper into the chasm brought new challenges, energy fields that had to be carefully navigated, mechanical guardians that required stealth and cunning to avoid, and environmental hazards that tested every modification she'd made to her equipment. Finally, after what felt like hours of careful infiltration, Sarah saw light ahead that was different from the warning pulses of security systems. This was the pure white light of a control chamber, the heart of the prison that had held Stormsinger for 3 millennia. The Nexus was just ahead, and with it either freedom for her friend or death for them both. The Nexus chamber exceeded even Stormsinger's detailed descriptions. Sarah emerged from the narrow tunnel into a vast underwater cavern, filled with crystalline structures that defied physics and reason. The central nexus rose like a twisted spire of living light, surrounded by dozens of smaller control crystals that pulsed in hypnotic patterns. Energy flowed between them in visible streams, creating a web of power that had held Stormsinger captive for 3,000 years. Sarah's instruments went wild as they tried to process the overwhelming energy signatures. The chamber was a masterpiece of devourer engineering, designed not just to imprison but to slowly harvest the life force of its victims. Viewing it from inside, Sarah could see how the system converted Ethrani life energy into power that maintained the entire complex. It was sophisticated parasitism on a scale that made her feel sick. But understanding the system's purpose also revealed its weakness. The Nexus wasn't just a prison control system. It was a power plant that had been running without maintenance for millennia. Components showed signs of wear, crystal formations had grown beyond their intended parameters, and several subsystems pulsed erratically, The Devourers had built well, but they hadn't planned for their absence. Sarah began her approach to the central nexus, using her scanner to map the energy flows and identify safe paths through the deadly field. Each step required careful calculation, as the wrong move could trigger defenses that would incinerate her instantly. The chamber's guardians were more sophisticated than those in the tunnel, floating geometric shapes that moved with liquid grace, their crystalline surfaces reflecting the chamber's light in patterns that hurt to look at directly. One guardian detected her despite her careful shielding. The creature moved like a living crystal, reshaping itself as it attacked with bolts of energy that left glowing scars on the chamber walls. Sarah's suit absorbed what it could, but she could feel the systems failing under the assault. Thinking quickly, she used the chamber's own geometry against the guardian, leading it into a position where its energy blasts struck one of the subsidiary crystals. The result was spectacular. The damaged crystal overloaded, sending feedback through the entire network that stunned the guardian long enough for Sarah to reach the central nexus. But her interference had triggered alarms throughout the system, and she could see more guardians converging on her position. Whatever she was going to do, it had to be fast. The central nexus was a marvel of alien engineering, a twisted spire of crystal and metal that rose from the chamber floor like a technological tree. Control interfaces covered its surface in patterns that seemed to shift when viewed directly, making Sarah's eyes water as she tried to focus on individual elements. This was technology so advanced it appeared magical, operating on principles that human science had barely begun to understand. But Sarah had studied the pattern Stormsinger had described, and she could see the mathematical relationships that governed the Nexus's operation. The Devourers used base 8 mathematics and crystalline resonance patterns that followed specific harmonic sequences. If she could identify the primary control interface and input the correct shutdown sequence, she might be able to release all the chains simultaneously. Working frantically as guardians closed in around her, Sarah interfaced her portable computer with the Nexus control system. The process was like trying to perform brain surgery with boxing gloves while translating an alien language. But gradually she began to understand the control protocols. The system was designed with multiple fail-safes to prevent exactly what she was attempting, but it also had emergency shutdown procedures that could be triggered by the right combination of inputs. A guardian's energy blast missed her by centimeters, leaving a molten scar in the Nexus's surface. Sarah realized she was running out of time. The shutdown sequence required 3 separate inputs at precisely timed intervals, and the slightest error would trigger a lockdown that would make the chains permanent. Worse, she was beginning to understand that the system was designed to kill its prisoners if tampered with, ensuring that even in death the Devourer's victims couldn't escape. Drawing on every piece of knowledge Stormsinger had shared about the prison's construction, Sarah began the shutdown sequence. The first input caused the entire chamber to pulse with angry red light, and the Guardian's attacks became more desperate. The second input made the Nexus itself begin to vibrate with harmonics that she could feel in her bones. Everything now depended on the third input, which had to be entered at the exact moment when the system's resonance reached its peak. Sarah watched her instruments as the energy patterns built toward the critical moment. The Guardians had stopped attacking, instead forming a circle around the Nexus as if they sensed that something fundamental was about to change. The chamber itself seemed to hold its breath as millennia of carefully maintained systems prepared for transformation. At the precise moment when the harmonic resonance peaked, Sarah entered the final shutdown command. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the entire chamber erupted in light as 3,000 years of accumulated energy was released at once. The Guardians collapsed as their power source vanished. The subsidiary crystals went dark one by one, and the great Nexus itself began to dim as its parasitic function finally ended. But Sarah's triumph was short-lived. The shutdown had triggered one final fail-safe. The chamber was collapsing as the energy that had held it stable for millennia suddenly vanished. Tons of rock and twisted metal began falling from the ceiling, as the ancient Devourer construction finally succumbed to geological forces. Sarah had perhaps minutes to escape before being crushed or drowned in the collapsing chamber. Racing toward the tunnel entrance as debris rained down around her, Sarah felt the Nexus's death throes through the water itself. Massive pressure waves knocked her off course, while chunks of falling crystal created deadly obstacles that had to be dodged or destroyed. Her modified suit was failing under the stress, and she could feel cold water beginning to seep through compromised seals. But as she reached the tunnel entrance, Sarah felt something that made all the danger worthwhile. Through the water came a sound she had never heard before. Stormsinger's voice raised in pure joy as the chains that had bound her for 3,000 years finally fell away. The dragon was free, and that knowledge gave Sarah the strength to make her own desperate escape from the collapsing chamber of horrors. Sarah's ascent through the collapsing chasm was a nightmare of falling debris and crushing pressure waves. Her equipment was failing piece by piece as the ancient Devourer complex tore itself apart in the wake of the Nexus shutdown. But above her, she could hear something that drove her forward through pain and exhaustion. The sound of Stormsinger's voice raised in songs of freedom that had been silent for 3 millennia. The dragon's joy was infectious, transmitted through subsonic vibrations that seemed to give Sarah strength, even as her suit's life support systems flashed critical warnings. Each meter of ascent brought her closer to safety, and to witnessing a liberation that would be remembered as long as either of their species survived. The sound of those ancient chains falling away echoed through the water like thunder, marking the end of an imprisonment that had lasted since before human civilization began. When Sarah finally burst from the chasm's mouth, she found Stormsinger transformed. Without the chain's constant drain on her life force, the dragon's scales blazed with bioluminescent patterns of incredible beauty. Her eyes, once dulled by centuries of suffering, now burned with fierce intelligence and vitality. Most dramatically, the wing fins that had been pinned against her body by the chain spread wide for the first time in 3,000 years. Stormsinger was truly magnificent in freedom. Her serpentine body moved through the water with liquid grace that spoke of absolute mastery over her element. The dragon was easily 40 meters long when fully extended, with wing fins that could span nearly half that distance. Patterns of light raced along her scales in complex displays that Sarah realized were expressions of emotion, too powerful for mere vocalizations. Dragon's first free act was to approach Sarah with movement so gentle they barely disturbed the water between them. Stormsinger's massive head came to rest near the exhausted human, and those ancient amber eyes regarded her with something approaching reverence. Through their established communication methods, the dragon expressed gratitude so profound it brought tears to Sarah's eyes even through her diving mask. But Stormsinger's liberation revealed more than just her physical magnificence. As the dragon began to move freely through the lake, her presence awakened responses from the ecosystem itself. Plants that had seemed ordinary suddenly bloomed with new colors, while schools of fish began forming complex patterns that suggested intelligence Sarah had never suspected. The lake had been waiting for its guardian's return. Stormsinger explained through rapid exchanges of mathematics and gesture that the Ethrani had been the shepherds of this world's waters. Each lake, river, and ocean had been tended by one of her kind, maintaining the delicate balance that allowed life to flourish. The Devourers had specifically targeted them because destroying the Ethrani would make the entire planet easier to consume. With her chains gone, Stormsinger could access abilities that had been suppressed for millennia. She demonstrated by calling to the depths of the lake, and Sarah watched in amazement as massive creatures emerged from trenches she hadn't known existed. Leviathans that dwarfed Earth's largest whales surfaced briefly before diving back to their hidden kingdoms, acknowledging their guardian's return with songs that made the water itself vibrate. But the dragon's newfound freedom also revealed the scope of the tragedy that had befallen her people. Stormsinger was not just the last Ethrani on this world, she was the last Ethrani anywhere. The Devourers had been thorough in their genocide, and the few who had escaped the initial assault had died in their chains over the long centuries. An entire species of incredible beauty and intelligence had been reduced to a single survivor. The weight of that knowledge should have crushed Stormsinger, but instead, it seemed to fuel her determination. Through increasingly sophisticated communication, she made Sarah understand that her freedom represented hope for more than just personal liberation. The Ethrani had left behind caches of knowledge and genetic material, hidden in locations only one of their kind could access. Stormsinger could not restore her species alone, but she could ensure their wisdom survived. As the dragon shared her people's history, Sarah began to understand why the encounter felt so significant. Humanity and the Ethrani shared more than just intelligence. They shared curiosity, compassion, and the drive to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Sarah's decision to risk everything for a stranger's freedom was exactly the kind of act that the Ethrani would have performed without Hesitation, Stormsinger proposed something that took Sarah's breath away. The dragon wanted to form a partnership with humanity, sharing Ethrani knowledge in exchange for help recovering the hidden caches left by her people. The technology and wisdom of a species that had mastered both art and science could advance human civilization by centuries while ensuring that Ethrani culture didn't die with its last representative. But there were complications. The other Ethrani caches were scattered across the galaxy, many in locations controlled by hostile forces or hidden in environments that would challenge even advanced human technology. Some were on worlds that had been sterilized by the Devourers, while others lay in the depths of space itself, protected by guardians that had waited for millennia for their creator's return. Sarah realized that freeing Stormsinger was only the beginning of a much larger adventure. The dragon's liberation would mean nothing if the knowledge and legacy of her people died with her. Together, they would need to convince humanity to join in a quest that would span star systems in decades, all to ensure that one of the galaxy's greatest civilizations wouldn't be forgotten. As they swam together through the lake that had been both prison and sanctuary, Sarah understood that she had become part of something larger than herself. The lonely human researcher and the last dragon of an extinct species had found in each other exactly what they needed: friendship, purpose, and the courage to attempt the impossible. The real journey was just beginning, but they would face it together, carrying hope across the stars. Sarah faced the most difficult decision of her career as she sat in her research station that evening, watching Stormsinger move through the lake like a living constellation. The dragon's bioluminescent displays were visible from the surface, creating patterns of light that transformed the night sky's reflection into something magical. But that beauty came with a problem that threatened to tear Sarah's world apart. Colonial authorities would arrive for their quarterly inspection in 2 days, and hiding a 40-meter dragon was impossible. Stormsinger's presence would be detected within hours of their arrival, and then everything would change. The dragon would become Earth's greatest xenobiological discovery, a specimen to be studied rather than a being to be befriended. Her knowledge would be extracted through careful interrogation, and her freedom would become another form of captivity. Sarah had already begun receiving communications from her supervisors, asking about the unusual energy readings detected from the lake. The Nexus's destruction had sent shockwaves through the planet's electromagnetic field that were impossible to hide. Soon someone would demand answers that Sarah couldn't give without betraying everything she and Stormsinger had fought to achieve. The dragon sensed her friend's distress and approached the shore where Sarah sat. Through their now sophisticated communication system, Stormsinger expressed understanding of the dilemma. The Ethrani had faced similar choices when the Devourers first arrived: cooperation that led to enslavement, or resistance that risked everything. Stormsinger would not see humanity torn apart by her presence, but the dragon had a proposal that was both wonderful and terrifying. Hidden in the deep trenches of the galaxy were Ethrani installations that remained functional after millennia of abandonment. These bases contained not just knowledge but living spaces designed for beings who valued both solitude and connection. Stormsinger could take Sarah to one of these installations, where they could continue their work without interference from any government or authority. The offer meant leaving everything Sarah had ever known: her career, her family, her entire species, to journey into the unknown with a being she'd known for less than a week. It was madness from any rational perspective, but as Sarah watched Stormsinger's graceful movements through the water, she realized that some opportunities only came once in a lifetime. Stormsinger shared glimpses of what such a journey would entail. The nearest Ethrani installation was in a system 3 jumps away, hidden in the depths of a gas giant's moon. The facility was designed to support multiple species, with environmental controls that could accommodate both human and Ethrani physiology. More importantly, it contained archives that held the collected knowledge of a civilization that had reached heights humanity could barely imagine. But leaving would mean abandoning her responsibilities to the colony and potentially depriving humanity of the greatest discovery in its history. Sarah wrestled with the moral implications of her choice. Did she have the right to make decisions that would affect her entire species? Was protecting Stormsinger's freedom worth potentially denying humanity access to Ethrani knowledge? The dragon seemed to understand Sarah's internal struggle without needing translation. Through gentle vocalizations and bioluminescent displays, Stormsinger reminded her that freedom could not be given as a gift. It had to be chosen. Humanity would have opportunities to encounter Ithrani knowledge in the future, but only if that knowledge was shared freely rather than taken by force. As the night wore on, Sarah found herself remembering why she had become a xenobiologist in the first place. She had dreamed of making contact with alien intelligence, of learning from beings who saw the universe through completely different perspectives. But she had always imagined that contact happening on humanity's terms, with humans in control of the interaction. Stormsinger offered something far more precious and dangerous, true partnership between equals, with all the risks and rewards that implied. The dragon wasn't offering to be humanity's teacher or guide, but rather to be Sarah's friend and colleague in a venture that neither could accomplish alone. It was the difference between studying an alien culture and becoming part of one. The arrival of a colonial patrol boat the next morning forced Sarah to make her choice quickly. She could see the official vessels approaching across the lake's surface, their sensors already detecting the unusual energy signatures that Stormsinger's presence created. In minutes, they would have questions that Sarah couldn't answer without dooming her friend to a lifetime of captivity. Disguised as scientific cooperation, Sarah made her decision with the clarity that comes from absolute certainty. She activated her emergency beacon, sending a message that would be interpreted as equipment failure requiring immediate evacuation. Then she gathered her most essential personal belongings and research data, leaving behind everything else that had defined her life until this moment. Stormsinger was waiting for her in the lake's depths, having prepared for departure while sensing Sarah's internal struggle. The dragon had fashioned a breathing apparatus from materials salvaged from the destroyed Nexus, using Ithrani biotechnology to create a system that would allow Sarah to survive in the aquatic environments of their destination. As Sarah sealed herself into the organic breathing apparatus, she felt the last ties to her old life dissolving. The device merged with her nervous system in ways that were both alien and strangely comfortable, allowing her to breathe water as easily as air while maintaining her human physiology. She was becoming something new, a hybrid being capable of existing in both worlds. The colonial patrol boats reached Sarah's research station, just as she and Stormsinger began their descent to the lake's deepest trenches. Hidden beneath tons of water and rock, they approached a transport pod that the dragon had recovered from the ruins of an ancient Ithrani facility. The pod was sleek and organic, grown rather than built, and large enough to carry both of them to the stars. As they settled into the transport pod's living interior, Sarah felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration that took her breath away. She was leaving behind everything familiar to journey into the unknown with a being from another world, trusting her life and future to friendship forged in the depths of an alien lake. It was either the greatest adventure in human history or the most spectacular mistake ever made. Stormsinger's hand rested gently on Sarah's shoulder as the transport pod sealed itself and began its journey toward the stars. Through their shared communication system, the dragon expressed gratitude and excitement for the adventure ahead. Together, they would recover the lost treasures of the Ithrani and perhaps forge the foundation for a friendship between species that could last for millennia. The Ithrani transport pod burst from Lake Zephiria's surface like a shooting star in reverse, its organic hull gleaming as it shed water and gained velocity. Sarah pressed against the pod's transparent sections, watching her former world shrink beneath them as they climbed toward the stars. The colonial patrol boats had converged on her abandoned research station, their crews undoubtedly puzzled by her sudden disappearance and the massive hole that had appeared in the lake floor. Stormsinger's presence filled the pod with calm confidence as she guided their vessel through the upper atmosphere with movements that seemed more like swimming than piloting. The dragon's integration with Ithrani technology was so complete that she and the pod functioned as a single entity, organic and mechanical systems working in perfect harmony. Sarah realized she was witnessing technology that made humanity's greatest achievements look primitive by comparison. As they achieved orbit, Sarah got her first clear view of Kepler 442c from space. The planet was beautiful beyond description, with swirling cloud patterns and vast oceans that sparkled with bioluminescent life. But she could also see the scars left by the Devourer War, dead zones where nothing grew, crystalline formations that jutted from the landscape like infected wounds, and the twisted remains of structures that had once housed thriving Ethrani communities. Stormsinger noticed Sarah's attention to the scarred landscape and shared memories that made the destruction personal and immediate. Through their neural link, Sarah experienced flashes of what this world had been like before the war. Cities that floated on the ocean's surfaces like living coral reefs, sky gardens where Ethrani had cultivated art and philosophy in equal measure, and vast underwater palaces where entire civilizations had thrived in harmony with their environment. The dragon's memories also revealed the true scope of what had been lost. The Ethrani hadn't just been artists and guardians. They had been explorers and scientists who had mapped much of the galaxy and established peaceful contact with dozens of species. Their knowledge included star charts that showed safe passages through regions humans considered impassable, communication protocols for races humanity hadn't yet encountered, and scientific discoveries that could revolutionize everything from medicine to faster-than-light travel. As their pod engaged its jump drive, Sarah experienced travel between stars as the Ethrani had designed it, not as violent acceleration through normal space, but as a gentle transition through dimensions where distance had different meanings. The journey that would have taken human ships weeks was accomplished in hours, with Sarah remaining conscious throughout. The process enabled to observe the beautiful, mathematical relationships that governed interdimensional travel. Their destination was a moon, orbiting a gas giant in a system that human star, charts labeled only as a navigation hazard. The moon appeared dead from the outside, its surface scarred by asteroid impacts and devoid of any obvious signs of life. But as Stormsinger guided their pod toward what looked like just another crater, Sarah began to detect energy signatures that indicated massive, technological installations hidden beneath the barren surface. The Ethrani base was a revelation that changed Sarah's understanding of what civilization could achieve. Hidden beneath kilometers of rock and ice was a facility that had maintained itself in perfect condition for over 3,000 years, waiting for its creator's return. Gardens filled with plants from a dozen worlds grew in chambers lit by artificial suns, while vast libraries contained the accumulated wisdom of species that had vanished before humanity learned to use fire. But most impressive was the base's central chamber, where Stormsinger led Sarah to witness something that no human had ever seen. Suspended in columns of living light were the genetic templates of the Ethrani themselves, not just DNA sequences, but complete biological and psychological patterns that contained everything needed to restore her species to life. Stormsinger was not the last of her kind, after all. She was the key to their resurrection. The process would not be simple or quick. Restoring the Ethrani would require resources and knowledge that currently existed nowhere in the galaxy. The genetic templates needed to be combined with consciousness patterns stored in quantum matrices, while the resulting beings would require decades of education to truly become Ethrani, rather than merely biological copies. It was a task that would require the cooperation of multiple species and potentially centuries of dedicated effort. But Sarah understood that she and Stormsinger had taken the first crucial step. By choosing friendship over fear, cooperation over exploitation, they had proven that different species could work together toward goals that benefited everyone. The Ethrani base contained detailed records of other species that had shown similar promise, creating a network of potential allies that stretched across known space and beyond. As Sarah explored the base's wonders with Stormsinger as her guide, she began to understand her new role in the galaxy. She was no longer just a human scientist studying alien life. She was an ambassador between worlds, carrying the responsibility of representing her species in relationships that could determine humanity's future among the stars. The weight of that responsibility was balanced by the incredible privilege of being the first human to see what the universe looked like from an Ethrani perspective. Stormsinger had plans that stretched far beyond simple knowledge sharing. The dragon intended to visit other Ethrani installations, gathering resources and allies for the eventual restoration of her people. But she also wanted to make contact with humanity on terms that would benefit both species, establishing relationships based on mutual respect rather than the exploitation that had characterized so many first contact scenarios. The two friends spent months in the hidden base, with Sarah learning to navigate Ethrani technology, while Stormsinger studied human culture through the records Sarah had brought with her. They became true partners in a venture that would span decades, each bringing unique perspectives to challenges that neither could face alone. Their friendship became the foundation for something larger, a new model for how different species could interact across the vast distances of space. When they finally departed the base, it was not as refugees fleeing their pasts, but as explorers heading toward a future they would create together. Their transport pod, now enhanced with technologies from the base, carried hopes and dreams that belonged to more than just two individuals. They carried the possibility that wisdom and compassion could triumph over fear and greed, that the galaxy's greatest treasures were not resources to be exploited but relationships to be cherished. Sarah's choice to free Stormsinger from her underwater prison had consequences that rippled across space and time. Years later, when humanity made formal contact with the restored Ethrani civilization, the foundation of trust built by one human's compassion and one dragon's hope would prove more valuable than any technology or scientific discovery. In choosing friendship over fame, Sarah had given her species something far more precious than knowledge. She had given them a place among the stars as partners rather than conquerors. The story of the human diver who freed an alien dragon became legend in both civilizations. Proof that the greatest adventures begin not with grand plans or vast resources, but with simple acts of kindness offered to strangers in need. In the depths of an alien lake, two beings had found each other and chosen to change the galaxy together, one friendship at a time.